Hey guys, we're back once again with human memory. We just talked about retrieval, getting things out of long-term memory, and using that information again. Now let's talk about forgetting, which is when you get things into long-term memory, but then they just kind of fade away. Okay? And it happens to the best of us. Some information is usually lost over time. So why? Why does this happen? What kind of things make us forget? Well, think about the things that we use to remember, and then think about the opposite, right? So encoding failure, um, low depth of processing, right? We talked about how important making those semantic connections is. We talked about failure to repeat, right? So when you don't rehearse things, you forget them. Okay. As a demonstration, that story that I read you earlier, which one of these sentences was the actual sentence that appeared in that story without looking back at it? You can pause it and go through them and see if you can figure it out. The answer, in fact, is D. Okay? D is the one that actually appeared in the passage. Now, you probably, like, why would it be important for you to know exactly how that sentence was composed? It's not. And your brain knows this. Your brain says, no, 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 I don't need to know all that crap. I need to know that we read a story about Galileo and how he came up with the idea of the telescope, right? We don't we don't need to know exactly how each sentence was composed. That's just way too much information. Okay? So, in part, this is because of how your memory works naturally, and in part, this is because you probably didn't make any meaningful connections of this story to anything in your life, right? Low depth of processing, and you didn't rehearse the. I mean, maybe you went back and rehearsed the passage, but I'm assuming that you didn't. Okay. So, what else makes us forget? Well, retrieval failure. Right? Um, we talked about the fact that Dory is not able to recall. Yes, she's not able to recall, though she's able to recognize, right? So that not being able to recall would be a retrieval failure. And retrieval failures can happen, one, because of, in the instance of like brain damage, someone like Dory, it can happen just because of decay over time. Okay. And it's just a matter of time for everyone, right? Use it or lose it. It goes back to the long-term potentiation. It goes back to Hebbian learning. The more you use it, the more you're going to sustain that particular information. But think about this. So Ebbinghaus did some experiments, and this is essentially the Ebbinghaus decay curve. Okay, and what he did, even though the experimental method was flawed because he used himself as both subject and experimenter. Luckily for him, this particular curve has been replicated many times. So you learn a list of words, you try and recall the words immediately, you try and recall them 20 minutes later, an hour, 9 hours. So this is without rehearsal, right? Without using that information, it decays over time, it leaves. So, what else makes us forget? Sorry about these animations, they make things weird. Um, what else makes us forget? We have things like interference. What do we mean by interference? Memory competition. Okay, so you've got old information there all the time. Okay, you have new information coming in. Sometimes this information can compete. Okay, so there's two types of interference. You can have retroactive interference and proactive interference. When we say retroactive, we're talking about incoming information, new knowledge is interfering with old knowledge. We see this with things like if you learn French and then you learn Spanish, the Spanish messes up the French, and you do worse on French. Okay, so you have retroactive information. New information is retroactively impairing old information. Okay, if you learn how to snowboard after you learned how to ski, okay, snowboarding, the sort of the muscle learning that happens during snowboarding will interrupt the knowledge that you have about how to ski. Now, proactive, on the other hand, is where old knowledge interferes with incoming information. So, um, For example, texting, the way you use your fingers nowadays, right, could interfere with doing something like learning how to play the piano. My real life example is at Rice. I would go to Rice every day, and they have this huge parking lot, and you just kind of park wherever you can find it, right? You guys know about this. You go to UTD, huge parking lot. There were some days where I would essentially end up going to some place that I parked like a week ago because that memory was interfering with the memory for where I parked the car today. Okay. It's the same thing as like when the year changes and you still write last year's number for a while, right? Old information is interfering with the absorption of new information. Okay. In closing, although we're going to talk about false memories real quick after this. Um, but in closing about this model, the modal model is great. Okay. You've got different memory stores. You've got the processes governing information between these memory stores, but there's a problem with the model, and that is that it's too simple. Okay, it doesn't account for working memory, doesn't account for the subcomponents in long-term memory. It doesn't account for the fact that rehearsal is not the only mechanism for encoding. Okay, so there are problems with this model. So that's all to say that it's important to be critical. It's important to build upon foundational knowledge, and cognitive science is no different. Okay, that's forgetting. We will move on to false memories, and that'll be the end of it for human memory. I'll see you there.